Alright, this is picking up the motivation and emotion chapter from Affiliation. So we'll move here through the end of motivation and emotion, and then there'll be another segment for the next chapter. Alright, we talked before about both mastery, competitiveness, and work orientation. And now we're going to talk a little bit about affiliation as a motive. The idea of being with others, expressing feelings and ideas, getting others' approval, can be influenced by fear and anxiety, so forth, as you see listed there. Fear and anxiety may be closely tied to the affiliation motive. The presence of others helps us to be calmer, so we like to be around other people to avoid fear and some anxiety. But environment can affect it as well. So the difference between affiliation and, say, competitiveness would be that somebody who's competitive might like affiliation, but they're much more focused on winning a competition or succeeding at a particular thing, while in the same situation, the person with the high affiliation motive would be more interested in whether or not they get along with people. Alright, so let's move on to the next section. We looked at motivation. Now let's take a look at emotion. So overall, emotion can cause motivation. Motivation can cause emotion. And we're going to take a look now very briefly at the research in psychology about emotion itself. Emotion helps us to respond to the demands of the environment. There's no question that it's something that is based on evolution. It's something that's necessary, just as pain is. But there's an interesting component to it, and that is that without emotion, human beings would probably just be robots. And yet it definitely interferes with our ability to be logical and sometimes even to make the right choices. However, as we all know, negative emotions are something we don't particularly like. But on the other hand, positive emotions actually put joy into life that wouldn't be there otherwise. So there's no question that our ancestors that didn't have emotion didn't make it, while the ones who did passed those along. So let's take a look at what researchers say about emotion. And our first researcher is Plutchik, who took the risk of trying to come up with basic emotions. And he came up with the 8 basics that you see listed here: fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, anticipation, joy, and acceptance. In Plutchik's circle there, you see emotions will vary in intensity, and in fact, as you can see here within the circle, acceptance and fear equal the larger category of submission. Surprise and sadness lead to disappointment. Surprise and fear, awe. Anticipation and anger, aggressiveness, and so forth. So it's a very interesting emotion wheel. Sadness and joy are opposites. Acceptance and disgust, anger and fear. So you see that Plutchik's ideas are interesting. And after some criticism and some retooling of his theory, he came up with his 3D model that you see over here. And in the 3D model, the more intense emotions are at the top, as you see here. And then as you move down the 3D model, the emotions are less intense. So let's talk a little bit about the criticism of Plutchik. Well, obviously, because he stuck his toe in the water of trying to come up with a certain list of emotions, he was criticized there for leaving something out or having something in there that some people didn't like. But one of the major criticisms, of course, is that because he speaks English, that it's related to English speakers. And what's interesting is just the idea we might have, or the idea we can look at here, the notion that these are the emotions that in general we all kind of accept or at least have some knowledge of, and they can affect what we actually think. You can see Worf's linguistic hypothesis here if you really want to take a look at it. Some cultures have no words for some English emotions. Again, here's our ideas about Plutchik. Some cultures don't have words for English emotions. English has 2,000 words for emotions. Taiwanese, Chinese, 750, and one tribal language has only 7. So again, if you remember Worf's linguistic hypothesis, the idea that the words or the language you use can affect the way you think, and vice versa, you could see here where emotion might be a big part of that. Now, other major researcher in emotion is Paul Ekman, and he did a fascinating study where he took pictures of people expressing particular emotions and took those around the world and had different people in different cultures look at these pictures. And what he found was almost universally that the 6 that you see here in the image were recognized by people around the world. Anger, fear, disgust, surprise, sadness, and there is no love in there, which is interesting because it's very true that the Western concept of romantic love is very much culturally specific. Love, its connection to everything else, and how it affects people, it varies quite a bit through different cultures. As you can see here, so you had the cross-cultural idea of emotions. He found those 6 primary. You see also here that the Tahitians have no word for sadness. Now, if you know anything about the island of Tahiti and how it's basically paradise, that would make some sense. And the Samoans, who live a pretty happy lifestyle, have no words for anxiety, depression, or guilt. So, again, thinking about Worf's linguistic hypothesis, does that mean that they're less likely to feel those emotions or have those sensations? Or is it because they think that way that they don't have them, or is it the language itself? It's an interesting question to ask. But Ekman's main contribution is that he found that at least these 6 seem to be universally understood around the world. All right, now let's take a quick look at the different theories about where emotion comes from. And how it's created. We start first with, we'll have 3. You'll have James Lange, Cannon-Bard, and the cognitive or Schachter's 2-factor theory. Now I want to go back here because as we go through these 3, and these are the 3 major theories in psychology about how emotions are actually created, one of the main issues here is the question of exactly how much power or how much control do you have over the emotions that you feel. Now, as we go through these 3, we're actually going to go through them in chronological order based on when they were created. And also, as you're going to see, as we go further through the list, there is each succeeding theory gives more credit to the human being for being able to have some choice or control over their emotions. So let's take a look at the first one, James Lange, and of course this is William James, one of the early psychologists who wrote the first, in essence, textbook in psychology, a very important American psychologist, went to Harvard, etc. And so he and another researcher by the name of Lange came up with the idea of this theory, and that is that you see the stimulus, or you perceive the stimulus, your autonomic system is aroused. And in this case with the snake, of course, you would immediately see the heart rate jumping, etc. And so because of what the autonomic system does, that's the creator of the emotion itself. So this one seems to be pretty basic, and it in essence says that whatever emotions you feel, you don't really think through very much. They're almost automatic responses. All right, our second theory, Cannon-Bard theory, gives humans a little more credit for being able to have some control over emotions. This came out around the 1920s. And as you see here, you have the eliciting stimulus. Then you have some brain activity, but it's not in the cortex. It's subcortical, meaning that it's not in the conscious part of the brain, but it seems to be in the basic automatic parts. And then simultaneously, you have the arousal of the autonomic system and the conscious emotion of fear. Now, this one still gives a lot of control to the part of the brain that's not really conscious. However, it gives you a little more time to think through it and to create the emotion that you might choose to have. But it's not as specific as James Lange. It gives a little, again, more time to make a decision as to what particular emotion you're going to have. And that leads us to the third one, which is the more modern one in the 1960s, and that's the cognitive theory or Schachter's two-factor theory. Now, the easiest way to understand this, and you can look at all these different images here, but you can also see it in this particular graph, which is a very good one, and you can see the Schachter theory. So let's go through the first one. James Lang: stimulus, autonomic system, fear; stimulus for Cannon-Bard, activity, and then you have a conscious feeling with the autonomic system. And Schachter gives you the most credit for being able to decide what emotion that you want to have or make a choice. You see the stimulus, you have the autonomic arousal, then your brain appraises it. Now this includes some conscious appraisal too, and then you choose the emotion that you're actually going to have. Now it's interesting, this one gives a lot more credit, but the question is, which one of these is better? Well, we're going to see some interesting research that came from neuroscience that kind of explains all of this as we move forward. But these three theories are theories you need to know definitely. And remember, again, as you go down the list, it gives you more credit for being able to control or choose your own emotion. All right, some influences of nonverbal communication on emotion. There's voice quality, the way people speak, the words they use. You pick up that information. And again, this is how you understand what other people are thinking by little things that they do that you pick up on. Now remember, and we were looking at earlier, the idea of how do you decide if somebody's lying to you. Well, as Phil's video said, you get all kinds of information from different levels of communication by that person. Not just what they say, but how they look, the way their voice changes, their posture, the mannerisms that they use, even the way the eyes move around. You get all that information, and your brain picks up on all of that, and then if it all seems to line up, then you're more likely to believe what the person is saying to you. But if everything seems to line up except the voice quality doesn't seem to fit, your brain will actually register that as something unusual. And so you'll begin to wonder whether or not they're actually telling you the truth. So voice quality is pretty important in all of that. Remember, the research showed that you would do best to listen to the person's tone of voice, because that's the hardest thing to actually control. Facial expressions. We pick up a ton of things, obviously, from this. Good example is when people shake their head no while they're saying yes, or they shake their head yes while they're saying no. Your brain actually picks up that variance and actually warns you that there might be something going on. Body language, if you're interested, you could turn over there to the YouTube listing and see a very interesting take on some great details in there. You're very familiar with how we pick up on other people's posture and how you send out emotional signals by the way you move around and the way you look at things and all kinds of different issues. And you pick up from other people the same way. Our personal space is pretty interesting because this is more of a cultural issue, but American personal space, or our personal space bubble, is a little larger than a lot of other cultures are, especially some cultures like in Italy and some other European cultures. When you go there, people seem to just get directly into your face when they're talking to you, and it's almost offensive to you, or it makes you a little bit uneasy. Interestingly, if whatever your personal space bubble is, you pick that up through your culture. And if somebody gets into your personal space, you will, whether you realize it or not, you'll begin to lean away or turn away in order to try and keep your personal space if possible. Gender and how we send out emotion. Obviously, there's a lot of different signals between the two genders. Usually at this point, I have the whole class sit like a girl and sit like a boy, and you know the difference between the two. And finally, culture and display rules. There are all kinds of symbols like pointing and saying you're number one and using the peace sign and all kinds of other things that mean one thing in our culture and may mean something totally different in another. Some of them rather humorous when you figure out what it is that you've actually said to someone. In fact, there are things in our culture that are very normal to do that would be quite offensive to other cultures. So here's our statement about neuroscience, and this is very interesting because what this basically says is that there's two processing systems for emotion. One is unconscious, seems to have a built-in innate sensitivity to certain cues. It's easily conditioned through classical conditioning. It responds quickly and uses implicit or memory you don't realize you're accessing as a basis. The other one is more conscious, linked to explicit memory as a basis, generates emotion more slowly, and so forth. So what this really shows, and the first one of course would be in line with the tarantula, but what this really shows is that the reason that the three theories exist for emotion in psychology is really supported by the fact that we have two